Michael Thompson stood at the balcony of his oceanfront mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, watching the waves crash against the private beach below. The remnants of last night's extravagant party lay scattered across the pristine sand. Empty champagne bottles, designer shoes forgotten in drunken revelry, and the occasional piece of expensive jewelry glinting in the morning sun. At 25, he was already one of America's most eligible bachelors, heir to the Thompson real estate empire, and completely alone in his gilded world. The morning breeze carried the salty scent of the Atlantic, but Michael barely noticed it. His attention was fixed on something that didn't belong in his perfectly curated universe, a scraggly caramel-colored mutt digging through the party debris. The sight of the dog irritated him beyond reason. This was the third time this week he'd spotted the creature trespassing on his property, and enough was enough. "Harrison," he called out to his butler, his voice sharp with annoyance. "Why hasn't security taken care of that mongrel yet?" The elderly butler appeared silently at his side, his face carefully neutral. "I apologize, Mr. Thompson. The dog seems quite adept at finding ways onto the property. Perhaps we could—" "I don't want excuses," Michael cut him off, running a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair. "I want results. This isn't some public beach where strays can roam freely. Make sure it doesn't happen again." As Harrison retreated with a bow, Michael's childhood friends Brandon and Tyler joined him on the balcony, both nursing hangovers from the previous night's festivities. Brandon, ever the yes man, immediately noticed Michael's irritation and followed his gaze to the dog below. "Still having trouble with that mutt?" Brandon asked, adjusting his designer sunglasses. "Want me to call someone to handle it?" Tyler shifted uncomfortably beside them, his kind eyes betraying his discomfort with the suggestion. "It's just a hungry dog, guys. Maybe we could—" "It's a nuisance," Michael interrupted, his jaw clenching. "And in the Thompson family, we don't tolerate nuisances." He picked up a small stone from one of his mother's decorative planters and hurled it at the dog. The animal yelped and scampered away, but not before turning to look at Michael with eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. Something about that look made Michael's stomach turn, but he pushed the feeling aside. He'd spent his entire life learning to ignore such inconvenient emotions. His father, Richard Thompson, had taught him well. Sentiment was a weakness that had no place in their world. As they moved to the breakfast table set up on the terrace, Michael couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. They reminded him of something he'd long tried to forget, the way he used to look at his own reflection as a child, standing alone in his massive bedroom, waiting for parents who were always too busy building an empire to notice their son's loneliness. "I'm thinking of throwing another party tonight," he announced, more to distract himself than anything else. "Something even bigger than last night. Maybe we could get that new DJ from New York." Brandon immediately began making calls, but Tyler studied his friend with concern. "Michael, don't you think maybe we could do something different? Like, I don't know, actually talk about what's bothering you?" Michael fixed him with a cold stare. "Nothing's bothering me, Tyler. I have everything I could ever want. Now, are you going to help plan this party? Or should I find someone else who will?" The threat hung in the air, and Tyler, like everyone else in Michael's life, backed down. But as the morning wore on and plans for another excessive celebration took shape, Michael kept finding his gaze drawn to the spot where the dog had been. Something was shifting inside him, a subtle crack in the perfect facade he'd spent his entire life maintaining. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a transformation that would shake the very foundations of his carefully constructed world. The dog would return, and with it would come a series of events that would force Michael Thompson to confront the empty shell his life had become. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Michael Thompson's private beach as he paced along the shoreline. The constant rhythm of the waves did little to soothe his growing agitation. His friends had left hours ago to prepare for tonight's hastily planned party, leaving Michael alone with thoughts he couldn't quite shake. He spotted movement out of the corner of his eye and turned to see the same caramel-colored mutt from earlier, cautiously approaching a pile of driftwood near the water's edge. Michael's first instinct was to shout, to scare the animal away, but something held him back. Instead, he found himself observing the dog with a mixture of curiosity and an emotion he couldn't quite name. The dog's ribs were visible through its matted fur, and it moved with the wariness of an animal accustomed to mistreatment. As it sniffed around the beach, occasionally glancing at Michael, he was struck by a realization. This creature was utterly alone in the world, much like he was, despite all his wealth and status. "Mr. Thompson," Harrison's voice interrupted his musings. "Your jet ski is prepared as requested." Michael nodded, a plan forming in his mind. It wasn't a kind plan, but it was one that aligned with the person he'd always been, someone who eliminated problems rather than facing them. "Bring me some rope," he ordered, his voice cold and detached. As Harrison hurried to comply, Michael approached the dog slowly. To his surprise, the animal didn't run. Instead, it watched him with those same piercing eyes that had haunted him all day. When he was close enough, Michael reached out and grabbed the dog's scruff. It yelped but didn't fight back, as if it had given up on kindness from humans long ago. With Harrison's help, Michael secured the dog to a makeshift float, a piece of driftwood with some rope. The animal whimpered softly, but its eyes never left Michael's face. Those eyes seemed to ask a question Michael wasn't ready to answer. Mounting his jet ski, Michael towed the makeshift raft out into the open ocean. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It should have been beautiful, but all Michael felt was a growing unease in the pit of his stomach. About a mile offshore, Michael stopped the jet ski and turned to look at the dog. It was shivering, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. For a moment he hesitated. This wasn't like destroying a business rival or buying out a competitor. This was a living, breathing creature that had done nothing to deserve such cruelty. "It's just a dog," he muttered to himself, trying to summon the cold indifference that had served him so well in the business world. But as he reached for the rope to untie it, the dog let out a soft whine. It wasn't a sound of fear or anger, but something that sounded almost like forgiveness. Michael's hand froze. In that instant, he saw himself reflected in the dog's eyes, not the powerful, confident billionaire he pretended to be, but the lonely, scared little boy he'd buried deep inside. He saw the child who had once cried himself to sleep, wishing for a friend who would love him unconditionally. With a frustrated growl, Michael gunned the jet ski's engine and headed back to shore, towing the dog behind him. He couldn't do it. For the first time in his adult life, Michael Thompson had found a line he couldn't cross. Back on the beach, Michael awkwardly untied the dog, avoiding its gaze. "Go on," he said gruffly, gesturing towards the road. "Get out of here before I change my mind." But the dog didn't run. Instead, it shook itself, sending water droplets flying, and then sat down right next to Michael's feet. It looked up at him with an expression that seemed to say, "I'm not going anywhere." Michael stared at the dog, then out at the ocean, then back at the dog. A laugh bubbled up from deep inside him, a genuine laugh, something he hadn't experienced in years. It was absurd. He'd just tried to abandon this animal in the middle of the ocean, and here it was, choosing to stay with him. "Fine," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You can stay for now, but don't get too comfortable. This isn't a permanent arrangement." As they walked back towards the mansion, Michael found himself talking to the dog, telling it about the party he was supposed to be hosting, about his father's expectations, about the emptiness he felt despite having everything money could buy. The dog trotted alongside him, occasionally looking up as if it understood every word. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Michael felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had no idea what he was going to do with a stray dog, or how this would fit into his carefully controlled life. But at that moment, he didn't care. Something had shifted, a small crack in the walls he'd built around his heart. As they reached the mansion, Harrison was waiting, his eyebrows raised in surprise at the sight of his employer and the bedraggled dog. "Shall I call animal control, sir?" he asked cautiously. Michael looked down at the dog, then back at Harrison. "No," he said firmly. "Find some food for Buddy here and clear my schedule for tomorrow. I think we both need a bath and some rest." Harrison nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Very good, sir. And the party?" Michael hesitated, then made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew him. "Cancel it. I have more important things to deal with tonight." As Harrison hurried off to make the arrangements, Michael knelt down next to the dog, Buddy, and looked into those knowing eyes once more. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted softly, "but I think you might be exactly what I needed." Buddy responded by gently licking Michael's hand, and in that simple gesture of unconditional acceptance, the first real cracks began to form in the walls around Michael Thompson's heart. The journey ahead would be far from easy, but in that moment a spark of change had been ignited, one that would ultimately transform not just Michael's life, but the lives of countless others in ways he could never have imagined. The following morning, Michael Thompson woke to an unfamiliar sensation, something warm and furry pressed against his side. For a moment he was disoriented, his mind struggling to reconcile the presence of Buddy with his usual solitary existence. The events of the previous day came flooding back, and he found himself staring at the sleeping dog with a mixture of bewilderment and something that felt dangerously close to affection. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his tousled hair. The Michael Thompson he knew didn't take in strays or cancel parties on a whim, yet here he was, sharing his king-sized bed with a formerly homeless dog. Buddy stirred, opening one eye to look at Michael before stretching languidly. There was no judgment in that gaze, no expectations, just a simple, uncomplicated acceptance that made Michael's chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion. As he went through his morning routine, Michael found himself constantly distracted by Buddy's presence. The dog followed him from room to room, tail wagging, as if he'd always been a part of this opulent world. It was unsettling, to say the least. "Mr. Thompson," Harrison's voice came from the doorway of the master bathroom, where Michael was attempting to brush his teeth while Buddy watched with curious eyes. "Your father is on the line. He's asking about the cancelled party and some rumors he's heard." Michael felt a flicker of his old anxiety. Richard Thompson was not a man who tolerated unexplained behavior, especially from his heir. "Tell him I'll call him back," Michael said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "I have some things to take care of first." Harrison nodded, a hint of concern in his eyes. "Very good, sir. And what shall I tell the staff about our new guest?" Michael looked down at Buddy, who was now contentedly chewing on the corner of a ridiculously expensive bath mat. In that moment, he made a decision. Tell them Buddy is staying, for now. And we'll need to make some arrangements. Food, a bed, whatever dogs need. If Harrison was surprised by this uncharacteristic display of consideration, he didn't show it. "I'll see to it immediately, sir." Left alone with Buddy once more, Michael found himself at a loss. He'd never had a pet before, had never wanted one. Pets were messy, unpredictable, and required attention. All things that Michael Thompson, rising star of the business world, had no time for. And yet, as he watched Buddy explore the vast expanse of his bedroom, tail wagging with unbridled joy at each new discovery, Michael felt something shift inside him. It was as if he was seeing his world through new eyes, eyes unclouded by expectations or the need to impress. "Come on, boy," he found himself saying. "Let's go for a walk." The simple act of attaching a makeshift leash, a silk tie that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, to Buddy's collar and heading out onto the grounds of his estate felt oddly liberating. For once, Michael wasn't worried about being seen, about maintaining his carefully crafted image. He was just a man walking his dog on a beautiful morning. As they strolled along the private beach, Michael found himself talking to Buddy, pouring out thoughts and feelings he'd never dared voice before. He talked about the pressure of being Richard Thompson's son, about the loneliness that came with always being the one in control, about the nagging feeling that something was missing from his life, despite all his wealth and success. Buddy listened without judgment, occasionally nuzzling Michael's hand or chasing after a seagull, his simple joy infectious. For the first time in years, Michael felt the tight knot of tension in his chest begin to loosen. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Michael turned to see Brandon and Tyler making their way down the beach, both looking confused and slightly concerned. "Mike!" Brandon called out. "What's going on, man?" "You cancelled the party. You're not answering your phone, and now you're walking a dog?" Michael tensed, his old instincts kicking in. He was about to snap at them, to reassert his usual dominance, when he felt Buddy press against his leg. Looking down, he saw those same understanding eyes gazing up at him. In that moment, Michael made a choice to be honest, perhaps for the first time in his adult life. "Guys," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I think I need to talk to you about some things, some changes I'm considering." Tyler's face lit up with hope, while Brandon looked skeptical. But as they walked back towards the mansion, With Buddy trotting happily alongside, Michael felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. Inside, as Harrison served them coffee on the terrace, Michael began to open up. He talked about his feelings of emptiness, about the facade he'd been maintaining for so long. He shared the story of how he'd almost abandoned Buddy at sea, and how the dog's forgiveness had touched something deep within him. Brandon listened in stunned silence, while Tyler nodded encouragingly. "I always knew there was more to you than just the tough businessman act," Tyler said softly. "This is the Mike I remember from when we were kids." As the conversation deepened, Michael found himself re-evaluating not just his own life, but his relationships as well. He realized that Tyler had always been trying to reach out, to be a true friend, while he had kept everyone at arm's length. "I don't know exactly what I'm going to do," Michael admitted, absently scratching Buddy behind the ears. "But I know I can't keep living the way I have been. There has to be more to life than just accumulating wealth and power." Brandon, ever the pragmatist, looked concerned. "But what about your father? The company? You can't just walk away from everything." Michael sighed, the weight of his responsibilities settling back onto his shoulders. "I'm not planning to walk away, but maybe there's a way to do things differently. To use our resources for something more meaningful." As they continued to talk, brainstorming ideas and sharing long-buried feelings, Michael felt a sense of connection he hadn't experienced in years. Buddy dozed at his feet, a constant reminder of the unexpected turn his life had taken. The path ahead was far from clear, and Michael knew there would be challenges, not least from his father and the board of directors. But for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt a spark of genuine excitement about the future. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the terrace, Michael looked at his friends, at Buddy, and out at the vast ocean beyond. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. And for once, that thought didn't terrify him. It filled him with hope. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of changes to Michael Thompson's life. The presence of Buddy had set in motion a transformation that was both exhilarating and terrifying. As Michael navigated this unfamiliar territory, he found himself re-evaluating every aspect of his existence. The most immediate challenge came in the form of Richard Thompson's reaction to his son's new hobby. The phone call Michael had been dreading finally came on a sunny Tuesday morning. "What's this I hear about you adopting a stray dog?" Richard's voice crackled through the speaker, a mix of confusion and disapproval evident in his tone. "And cancelling parties? Are you having some kind of breakdown, son?" Michael took a deep breath, glancing down at Buddy, who was curled up at his feet. "No, Dad. I'm not having a breakdown. I'm just reassessing some things." "Reassessing?" Richard scoffed. "We're in the middle of the biggest deal of the year, and you're playing house with a mutt? This isn't like you, Michael. I need you focused." In the past, those words would have sent Michael scrambling to appease his father, to prove his worth. But now, with Buddy's steady presence grounding him, he found the strength to stand his ground. "I am focused, Dad," he said, surprised by the calmness in his voice. "But I'm starting to think there might be more to life than just closing deals. Maybe we could use our resources to make a real difference in the world." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "We'll discuss this when I return from London. In the meantime, I expect you to pull yourself together and act like the heir to this company. Is that clear?" Michael ended the call feeling a mixture of anxiety and a strange sense of liberation. He knew the conversation was far from over, but for the first time in his life, he'd stood up to his father's expectations. As the days passed, Michael found himself drawn more and more into Buddy's world. He discovered a local animal shelter that was struggling to stay afloat and began volunteering there in his spare time. The shelter staff were initially wary of the billionaire in their midst, but Michael's genuine enthusiasm and Buddy's charming presence soon won them over. It was during one of these volunteer sessions that Michael met Sarah, a dedicated veterinarian who ran the shelter on a shoestring budget. Unlike the socialites and business associates he was used to, Sarah was refreshingly direct and passionate about her work. "Why is someone like you really here?" she asked him bluntly one afternoon as they walked dogs together. "Is this some kind of PR stunt for your company?" Michael was taken aback by her frankness, but found himself appreciating her honesty. "It started with Buddy," he admitted, gesturing to the caramel-colored dog trotting happily beside him. "He made me realize how empty my life was, how much I'd been missing by focusing only on wealth and status. I guess I'm here trying to figure out how to change that." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "Well, Mr. Thompson, if you're serious about making a difference, we could certainly use your help. These animals need more than just money. They need people who care." As they continued to talk, Michael found himself opening up to Sarah in a way he never had with anyone before. He shared his fears about disappointing his father, his growing disillusionment with the cutthroat business world, and his desire to do something truly meaningful with his life. Sarah listened without judgment, offering insights and challenging his perspectives in ways that both excited and unnerved him. By the end of the afternoon, Michael realized he'd found not just a potential ally in his quest for change, but perhaps something more, a genuine connection with someone who saw beyond his family name and bank account. Back at the mansion, Michael threw himself into researching animal welfare organizations and sustainable business practices. He spent hours on video calls with Tyler, who had enthusiastically embraced his friend's new direction, brainstorming ideas for how to integrate more socially responsible initiatives into the Thompson Company's operations. Brandon, ever the voice of caution, warned Michael about the potential backlash from the board and shareholders. "You can't just change the entire direction of a multi-billion-dollar company overnight," he argued during one heated discussion. "Think about the jobs at stake, the investors who depend on our returns." Michael understood his friend's concerns, but he also felt a growing conviction that change was necessary, not just for him, but for the company's long-term sustainability. "We have the resources to make a real difference," he countered. "Imagine if we could set an example for other corporations, show them that profit and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive." As the debate raged on, Buddy sat quietly at Michael's side, a constant reminder of the simple wisdom that had started this journey. In moments of doubt, when the enormity of the challenge ahead seemed overwhelming, Michael would look into those understanding eyes and find the strength to continue. The true test came when Richard Thompson returned from his business trip, demanding a full explanation for his son's erratic behavior. Michael steeled himself for the confrontation, knowing that this could be the defining moment of his new path. To his surprise, it was Buddy who broke the tension. As Richard paced the study, his voice rising with each pointed question, the dog calmly walked over and placed his head on the older man's knee. Richard, caught off guard, instinctively reached down to pat Buddy's head. In that moment of unexpected connection, Michael saw a flicker of something in his father's eyes, a softening, a hint of the man he remembered from his early childhood before the pressures of the business world had hardened him. "Dad," Michael said softly, seizing the opportunity, "I know this seems crazy to you, but I really believe we have a chance to do something important here, to leave a legacy that's about more than just money." Richard looked at his son, then back at Buddy, who was now wagging his tail contentedly. "You really care about this, don't you?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Michael nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I do, Dad. More than I've cared about anything in a long time." As the sun set outside the study windows, father and son began a long, honest conversation about the future, not just of the company, but of their relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of frustration on both sides. But for the first time in years, they were truly talking to each other. By the time Richard left, no firm decisions had been made, but a door had been opened. Michael watched his father's car disappear down the driveway, feeling a mix of hope and trepidation about the path ahead. Buddy nuzzled his hand, as if sensing his conflicting emotions. Michael smiled down at the dog who had changed everything. "Well, boy," he said softly, "I guess we're really doing this. You ready for the next chapter?" As if in answer, Buddy barked once, tail wagging. And in that moment, despite the challenges that lay ahead, Michael Thompson felt more alive and purposeful than he had in years. The journey of transformation had only just begun, but with Buddy by his side and a growing circle of allies, he was ready to face whatever came next. As autumn settled over Newport, bringing with it a crisp breeze and vibrant foliage, Michael Thompson found himself navigating uncharted waters. The tentative understanding he'd reached with his father had opened the door to change, but implementing that change proved to be a monumental task. The Thompson Corporation board meeting was scheduled for the end of October, and Michael knew this would be his opportunity to present his vision for a more socially responsible direction for the company. He spent countless hours preparing, often working late into the night, with Buddy curled up at his feet. Sarah from the animal shelter had become an invaluable ally and friend during this time. Her practical experience in non-profit management provided a grounding perspective to Michael's ambitious ideas. Their late-night strategy sessions, fueled by coffee and shared passion, often blurred the lines between professional collaboration and something more personal. One evening, as they pored over proposal drafts, Sarah looked up at Michael with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You know, when you first showed up at the shelter, I thought you were just another rich guy trying to ease his conscience. But this," she gestured to the papers spread out before them, "this is really something, Michael. You're putting everything on the line for this." Michael ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of her words. "I have to," he said softly. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing something that matters, something that could make a real difference." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand, a gesture that sent an unexpected jolt through Michael. "Just be careful, okay? The corporate world can be brutal, especially when you're trying to change the status quo." As the board meeting approached, Michael faced resistance from unexpected quarters. Brandon, who had initially been supportive, began to voice concerns about the potential financial impact of Michael's proposed changes. "Look, Mike," Brandon said during a tense lunch meeting, "I get that you want to do good, but we have a responsibility to our shareholders. They're not going to be happy if our profits take a hit because we're suddenly funneling money into animal shelters and environmental initiatives." Michael felt a flare of anger at his friend's words. "It's not just about animal shelters, Brandon. It's about creating a sustainable business model that considers more than just the bottom line. Don't you see that this could position us as leaders in corporate responsibility?" Tyler, ever the mediator, tried to bridge the gap between his friends. "Maybe we could start with smaller initiatives. Test the waters before committing to a full overhaul." But Michael was resolute. He knew that incremental change wouldn't be enough. The night before the board meeting, he stood on the balcony of his mansion, Buddy at his side, looking out over the ocean. The dog nuzzled his hand, as if sensing his anxiety. "This could change everything, boy," Michael murmured. "Or it could end my career before it really begins. Am I crazy for doing this?" Buddy's steady gaze seemed to offer reassurance, and Michael found strength in the unconditional support of his furry companion. He thought of Sarah, of the shelter animals, of the potential to use the Thompson fortune for real, lasting good. With renewed determination, he went inside to make his final preparations. The board meeting was a battleground from the moment Michael began his presentation. Richard Thompson sat silently at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as his son outlined a vision for a radically different Thompson Corporation. Michael proposed redirecting a significant portion of the company's profits into a newly created Thompson Foundation, which would focus on animal welfare, environmental conservation, and community development. He outlined plans for sustainable building practices in their real estate developments, partnerships with local shelters and rescue organizations, and a company-wide volunteer program. The reaction was mixed. Some board members were intrigued by the potential for positive PR and the long-term benefits of sustainable practices. Others were openly hostile, accusing Michael of naive idealism that would tank the company's stock prices. As the debate raged, Michael stood his ground, countering each objection with well-researched data and passionate arguments. He could feel the momentum shifting, could see some of the skeptical faces beginning to consider the possibilities. Just as it seemed he might be winning them over, the CFO, a longtime ally of Richard's, dropped a bombshell. "This is all very touching," he sneered, "but perhaps the board should know about Mr. Thompson's personal involvement in this matter." Michael felt his heart sink as the CFO produced photographs, images of him at the shelter, walking dogs with Sarah, the two of them laughing together over coffee. "Is this really about corporate responsibility?" the CFO continued. "Or is it about impressing a pretty vet?" The room erupted into chaos. Michael tried to speak over the noise, to explain, but he could see the doubt creeping into the faces of those who had been on his side. He looked to his father, hoping for support, but Richard's expression was stone cold. Just as it seemed everything was falling apart, an unexpected voice cut through the din. "Enough!" Everyone turned in shock to see Harrison, Michael's usually silent butler, standing in the doorway. "Forgive the interruption," Harrison said, his voice steady despite the unusual circumstances, "but I believe there's someone here who might offer a valuable perspective on Mr. Thompson's proposal." To Michael's astonishment, Sarah walked into the room, looking professional and determined in a smart business suit. Behind her came a parade of people: shelter volunteers, rescued animals and their adopters, even some of the Thompson Corporation's employees who had been touched by Michael's volunteer efforts. As Sarah began to speak, presenting hard data on the positive impact of corporate social responsibility initiatives, Michael felt a surge of gratitude and something else, a realization that he wasn't alone in this fight. He had allies, supporters, people who believed in his vision. The meeting stretched on for hours, but by the end a tentative agreement had been reached. The board would allow a pilot program, implementing some of Michael's ideas on a smaller scale, with the potential for expansion if successful. As people filed out of the room, Richard Thompson approached his son. For a moment they stood in silence, years of unspoken words hanging between them. Then, to Michael's surprise, his father clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got guts, son," Richard said gruffly. "Your methods are unconventional, but maybe that's what this company needs. Don't make me regret this." As the sun set over Newport that evening, Michael stood on his balcony once more, this time with Sarah and Buddy by his side. The future was still uncertain, the path ahead full of challenges, but for the first time, he felt truly alive, truly purposeful. "Thank you," he said softly to Sarah, "for believing in me, for standing up for this." Sarah smiled, her hand finding his. "Thank Buddy," she replied. "He's the one who showed you what really matters." As if on cue, Buddy barked happily, tail wagging, and in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of newfound purpose and genuine connection, Michael Thompson knew that no matter what came next, he was on the right path at last. The months following the board meeting were a whirlwind of activity for Michael Thompson. Implementing the pilot program for corporate social responsibility proved to be both exhilarating and exhausting. Every day brought new challenges, unexpected obstacles, and moments of triumph that reminded Michael why he had embarked on this journey in the first place. The Thompson Foundation, still in its infancy, began to take shape. Michael threw himself into the work, dividing his time between the corporate offices and various community projects. He found himself in boardrooms one day, discussing sustainable building practices, and at local animal shelters the next, rolling up his sleeves to help with renovations. Buddy, ever faithful, accompanied Michael on many of these outings, becoming something of a mascot for the foundation. The sight of the billionaire heir and his rescue dog working side by side at community events did wonders for public relations, though Michael was more concerned with the actual impact they were making. Sarah had become an integral part of the Foundation's animal welfare initiatives, her expertise invaluable in shaping policies and programs. Their working relationship had deepened into a close friendship, teetering on the edge of something more, though neither seemed ready to cross that line just yet. One crisp November morning, as Michael and Sarah walked through a neighborhood where the Thompson Foundation was funding the renovation of a community center, Buddy trotting happily ahead of them, Sarah broached a delicate subject. "Michael," she began hesitantly, "I've been meaning to talk to you about something. There's been some gossip around the shelter, and even in some of the local papers." Michael felt a knot form in his stomach. He had a feeling he knew where this was going. "About us, you mean?" Sarah nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. "People are speculating about the nature of our relationship, and some are suggesting that it's influencing the Foundation's decisions." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. He'd been so focused on the work, on proving the value of their initiatives, that he'd neglected to consider how his personal life might be perceived. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said softly. "I never meant to put you in an uncomfortable position. You know that your involvement in the Foundation is based solely on your expertise and dedication, right?" "I know that," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "But perception matters. especially when we're trying to build trust in the community. Maybe we should, I don't know, be more professional in public. The suggestion stung more than Michael expected. He'd come to value Sarah's companionship, the easy rapport they'd developed. The thought of distancing himself from her, even if just for appearance's sake, felt wrong. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion up ahead. Buddy had wandered into a small park where a group of children were playing. One little girl, no more than 7 years old, was crying. Surrounded by a group of concerned adults, Michael and Sarah rushed over, concern etched on their faces. To their surprise, they found Buddy sitting patiently by the little girl's side, his head resting gently on her knee. "What happened?" Michael asked, kneeling down beside them. An older woman, presumably the girl's grandmother, explained. "Lisa here took a tumble off the swing. She scraped her knee pretty badly. We were trying to calm her down when your dog came over. He's been sitting with her ever since, wouldn't budge an inch." Sarah immediately went into vet mode, gently examining Lisa's knee, while Michael marveled at Buddy's intuitive kindness. As Sarah cleaned and bandaged the scrape, using the first aid kit she always carried, Michael found himself telling Lisa and the other children about Buddy's rescue story. "You see," he said, his voice soft but passionate, "Buddy here knows what it's like to be hurt and alone, but he also knows how much difference a little kindness can make. That's why he came to sit with you, Lisa. He wanted you to know you weren't alone." The children listened wide-eyed as Michael went on to explain the work of the Thompson Foundation, how they were trying to help animals like Buddy and people in their community. By the time Sarah finished treating Lisa's knee, a small crowd had gathered, listening intently. As they said their goodbyes, promising to bring Buddy back to visit the park again soon, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. This, he realized, was what it was all about. Not just grand gestures and big donations, but small moments of connection and compassion. Walking back towards the community center, Michael turned to Sarah. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think we've been going about this all wrong. We've been so worried about appearances, about proving ourselves to the board and the shareholders, that we've lost sight of what really matters." Sarah looked at him quizzically. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Michael continued, a new energy in his voice, "that we should be focusing on moments like what just happened in the park, real connections with real people, showing them that we're not just some faceless corporation, but individuals who genuinely care about making a difference." As they discussed this new approach, brainstorming ideas for more community engagement and hands-on involvement, Michael felt the earlier tension between them dissipate. They were partners in this endeavor, whatever else they might be to each other, and that partnership was making a real difference. Back at the Thompson mansion that evening, Michael sat in his study, Buddy dozing at his feet. He was drafting an email to the board, outlining his plans for increased community engagement and proposing a series of town hall meetings to get direct feedback from the people they were trying to help. As he worked, Michael reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few short months. The old Michael Thompson, focused solely on profits and prestige, seemed like a stranger now. There were still challenges ahead, skeptical board members to convince, logistical hurdles to overcome, but for the first time, Michael felt truly aligned with his purpose. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Harrison, bearing a tray with coffee and a small plate of dog treats. "Pardon the interruption, sir," the butler said, a hint of pride in his voice. "I thought you might need some refreshment. And if I may say so, it's been a pleasure to see the changes you've been making. Your parents would be proud." Michael blinked, surprised by the personal comment from his usually reserved butler. "Thank you, Harrison," he said warmly. "That means a lot." As Harrison left, Michael turned back to his computer, energized. He had a long night of work ahead, but it no longer felt like a burden. With Buddy by his side, and a clear vision of what he wanted to achieve, Michael Thompson was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, one small act of kindness at a time. As winter settled over Newport, bringing with it icy winds and early snowfalls, the Thompson Foundation faced its first major crisis. The pilot program had been running for several months, gaining traction in the community and even attracting positive attention from national media. However, not everyone was pleased with the new direction of the Thompson Corporation. It started with a series of pointed articles in financial publications, questioning the wisdom of diverting corporate funds to charitable causes. The criticisms were subtle at first, couched in terms of fiduciary responsibility and shareholder value, but as the weeks went on, the attacks became more direct and personal. Michael was in the middle of a community meeting, discussing plans for a new green space in an underserved neighborhood, when Brandon burst in, his face pale with concern. "Mike, we've got a problem," he said, pulling Michael aside. "Someone's leaked financial projections to the press. They're running stories claiming that the foundation's activities are tanking our stock prices." Michael felt his stomach drop. He'd been so focused on the positive impact they were making that he'd neglected to prepare for this kind of backlash. "How bad is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Bad enough," Brandon replied grimly. "The board is calling an emergency meeting. There's talk of suspending the foundation's activities pending a full review." The next few days were a blur of crisis management. Michael found himself shuttling between boardrooms and press conferences, defending the foundation's work and trying to reassure nervous investors. Sarah and the foundation team worked around the clock, compiling data on the tangible benefits of their programs. Through it all, Buddy remained a constant source of comfort. Late one night, as Michael pored over financial reports in his study, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, the dog padded over and rested his head on Michael's knee. The simple gesture brought tears to Michael's eyes. "What if I've messed everything up, boy?" he whispered, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "What if they're right, and I'm just a naive rich kid playing at being a philanthropist?" A soft knock at the door interrupted his moment of doubt. It was Sarah, bearing 2 mugs of steaming coffee and a determined look in her eyes. "All right, enough wallowing," she said, setting the mugs down and pulling up a chair. "We've got work to do." Over the next few hours, Michael and Sarah pored over the foundation's records, identifying success stories and quantifiable impacts. They crafted a presentation that not only addressed the financial concerns, but also highlighted the long-term benefits of corporate social responsibility. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the snow-covered grounds of the Thompson estate, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. They had a plan, a way forward, but the real test was yet to come. The board meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. As Michael prepared to leave, adjusting his tie in the mirror, he felt a familiar presence at his side. Buddy sat there, tail wagging, a look of unwavering trust in his eyes. On impulse, Michael knelt down and hugged the dog tightly. "Wish me luck, Buddy," he murmured. "We've got a fight ahead of us." The boardroom was tense as Michael began his presentation. He could feel the skepticism radiating from some of the older board members, the ones who had been most vocal about their concerns. But as he spoke, laying out not just numbers and projections, but real stories of lives changed and communities improved, he saw a shift in their expressions. He told them about Lisa, the little girl from the park, whose family had become active volunteers at the local animal shelter. He shared data on reduced crime rates in neighborhoods where they'd funded community centers and green spaces. And he presented a long-term vision of a corporation that not only made profits but also made a real difference in the world. As Michael concluded, the room fell silent. He held his breath, waiting for the response. It was his father who spoke first. Richard Thompson stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "Son," he began, and Michael braced himself for criticism. But then, to everyone's surprise, a small smile played at the corners of Richard's mouth. "I think you might be onto something here." The tide began to turn. Board members who had been skeptical now asked thoughtful questions about expanding the foundation's reach. Those who had supported Michael from the beginning spoke up with renewed enthusiasm. By the end of the meeting, not only had the foundation's activities been approved to continue, but additional funding had been allocated for new initiatives. As Michael left the boardroom, feeling a mixture of relief and exhilaration, he found Sarah waiting for him in the hallway. Without thinking, he swept her up in a hug, spinning her around in his excitement. "We did it!" he exclaimed, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "Sarah, we actually did it!" Their eyes met, and in that moment all the unspoken feelings between them came rushing to the surface. Sarah's smile softened, and she reached up to touch Michael's cheek gently. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" she said softly. Michael nodded, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. "Sarah, But before he could finish his thought, they were interrupted by the sound of applause. Turning, They saw a group of employees gathered in the hallway, led by Harrison. The butler's usually stoic expression was replaced by a broad smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Thompson," Harrison said warmly. "Word of the board's decision has already spread. The staff wanted to show their support." As Michael and Sarah made their way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and heartfelt thanks, Michael felt a profound sense of purpose. This was more than just a business or even a foundation. It was a movement, a chance to redefine what corporate success could look like. Later that evening, as Michael stood on the balcony of his mansion, Buddy at his side and Sarah's hand in his, he looked out over the snow-covered landscape of Newport. The challenges weren't over. There would always be skeptics to convince and new hurdles to overcome. But for the first time, he felt truly confident in the path he had chosen. "You know," he said to Sarah, squeezing her hand gently, "I think this is just the beginning. We've got so much more we can do." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "I can't wait to see what comes next," she replied. As they stood there watching the sun set over the winter landscape, Michael Thompson knew that whatever storms lay ahead, he had the strength, the support, and the purpose to weather them all. With Buddy's unconditional love, Sarah's unwavering partnership, and a growing community of allies, the future looked brighter than ever before. Spring arrived in Newport with a burst of color and renewed energy. The Thompson Foundation, having weathered its first major crisis, was now entering a phase of expansion and innovation. Michael, emboldened by the board's support and the growing public enthusiasm for their initiatives, was determined to push even further. One sunny morning, Michael stood in front of a dilapidated building in downtown Newport, Buddy at his side and Sarah holding his hand. This abandoned factory, once a symbol of the city's industrial past, was about to become the cornerstone of their most ambitious project yet. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her eyes scanning the crumbling facade. "It's going to take a lot of work to transform this place." Michael nodded, a gleam of excitement in his eyes. "That's exactly why it's perfect. This isn't just about renovation, Sarah. It's about renewal for the building, for the neighborhood, for the whole community." The plan was audacious: transform the old factory into a multi-purpose community center. It would house a state-of-the-art animal shelter, a vocational training center for at-risk youth, a green technology incubator, and affordable housing units. It was a project that would test the limits of the Thompson Foundation's resources and Michael's leadership. As they walked through the cavernous interior, Michael outlined his vision to the architects and project managers who had gathered for the initial assessment. Buddy trotted alongside, occasionally stopping to sniff at interesting corners, as if he too was inspecting the site. "We're not just building a structure," Michael explained, his voice echoing in the empty space. "We're creating a model for sustainable urban development. Every aspect of this project needs to reflect our commitment to social responsibility and environmental stewardship." The team listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others looking slightly overwhelmed by the scope of the project. But Michael's enthusiasm was infectious, and soon ideas were flying back and forth, each more innovative than the last. As the meeting wrapped up and the team dispersed to begin their preliminary work, Sarah pulled Michael aside. "You know, when you first told me about this idea, I thought you might be overreaching," she admitted. "But seeing you here, laying out this vision, I get it now. This could really change lives." Michael smiled, drawing her close. "It already has," he said softly. "Mine, for starters. And it's all thanks to a certain four-legged friend of ours." They both looked down at Buddy, who wagged his tail as if he understood he was being discussed. The dog that had once been abandoned and alone was now at the center of a movement that was reshaping an entire community. Over the next few months, the project began to take shape. There were challenges, of course, unexpected structural issues, zoning complications, and the occasional clash with local officials who were skeptical of such an ambitious undertaking. But Michael faced each obstacle with a determination that inspired his team and gradually won over even the most ardent critics. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when Michael decided to involve the local community directly in the planning process. He organized a series of town hall meetings, inviting residents to share their ideas and concerns. Initially, turnout was low, with many locals viewing the project with suspicion. But Michael's sincerity and willingness to listen gradually won people over. Buddy, who attended every meeting, became something of a local celebrity, breaking the ice with even the most reticent attendees. Children would flock to pet him, and their parents would end up in deep discussions about the neighborhood's needs and aspirations. As summer approached, the old factory began to transform. The sound of construction filled the air, and colorful murals, designed by local artists, began to appear on the surrounding walls. The project was breathing new life into the entire neighborhood. It wasn't all smooth sailing, however. Late one night, as Michael was working late at the construction site, he received an urgent call from Brandon. "Mike, we've got a problem." Brandon's voice was tense. "Some of our major shareholders are getting nervous about the amount of resources we're pouring into this project. There's talk of a potential vote of no confidence at the next board meeting." Michael felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of resolve. He'd faced doubters before, and he knew that the work they were doing was too important to abandon. "Thanks for the heads up, Brandon," he said, his voice steady. "Set up a meeting with the concerned shareholders for tomorrow. I want to show them exactly what their investment is building." The next day, Michael led a group of skeptical investors through the construction site. He showed them the progress on the animal shelter, introducing them to some of the rescue animals that were already being cared for in a temporary facility on site. He took them to the vocational training center, where local teens were learning green construction techniques by working on the very building that would house their future classes. As the tour progressed, Michael could see the investors' expressions changing from doubt to interest, and finally to genuine enthusiasm. By the time they reached the rooftop garden, a space that would provide fresh produce for the community and serve as a living laboratory for sustainable urban agriculture, even the most hardened skeptics were nodding in approval. "Mr. Thompson," one of the investors said as they concluded the tour, "I have to admit, when I came here today, I was prepared to advocate for scaling back this project. But seeing it in person, understanding the impact it's already having, well, let's just say you can count on my continued support." As the investors left, clearly impressed, Sarah approached Michael with a broad smile. "You did it again," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You made them see what we see." Michael shook his head, pulling her close. "No, we did it. All of us. This isn't just my vision anymore, Sarah. It belongs to everyone who's put their heart and soul into making it a reality." That evening, as the sun set over Newport, casting a golden glow over the transformed factory and the bustling neighborhood around it, Michael stood on the rooftop garden with Sarah and Buddy. He looked out over the city, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. "You know," he said softly, "when I first took in Buddy, I thought I was saving him. But the truth is, he saved me. He showed me what really matters in life." Sarah squeezed his hand, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And now you're both helping to save an entire community," she added. As they stood there, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the promise of even greater things to come, Michael Thompson felt a sense of peace and purpose he'd never known before. The journey wasn't over. There would always be new challenges to face, new horizons to explore. But with Buddy by his side, Sarah in his heart, and a community rallying behind their shared vision, he knew that anything was possible. The transformation of Newport was just beginning, and Michael couldn't wait to see what the future would bring. 5 years had passed since that fateful day when Michael Thompson first encountered a stray dog on his private beach. As he stood on the stage of the newly completed Thompson Community Center, preparing to give a speech at its grand opening, he couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. The center was a testament to what could be achieved when vision, resources, and community spirit came together. The once abandoned factory had been transformed into a bustling hub of activity, its walls adorned with vibrant murals that told the story of Newport's rebirth. Solar panels glinted on the roof, powering the entire complex and serving as a symbol of the city's commitment to sustainability. As Michael looked out over the crowd gathered for the opening ceremony, he saw faces both familiar and new. There was Brandon, who had become one of the foundation's most ardent supporters, despite his initial skepticism. Tyler stood nearby, beaming with pride. He had taken charge of the center's youth programs, finally finding his true calling. Richard Thompson sat in the front row, a changed man from the hard-driving businessman of years past. The success of the foundation had opened his eyes to a new way of measuring success, and he had become one of its most vocal advocates in the corporate world. But it was the faces Michael didn't recognize that truly moved him. Families from the neighborhood, small business owners whose shops had been revitalized by the area's renewal, students eager to start their training programs, all were there, their eyes shining with hope and excitement for the future. As the mayor of Newport stepped up to introduce him, Michael felt a familiar presence at his side. Buddy, now gray around the muzzle, but still full of life, pressed against his leg. The dog that had once been abandoned and alone was now as much a part of this community as anyone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor announced, "it gives me great pleasure to introduce the man who has been the driving force behind this incredible transformation. A man who saw potential where others saw only decay, who believed in the power of compassion to change not just individual lives, but entire communities. Please welcome Michael Thompson." As Michael stepped up to the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. He looked down at his prepared speech, then set it aside. This moment called for something more personal, more from the heart. "5 years ago," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I was a different person. I thought I had everything, money, power, success. But the truth is, I had nothing that really mattered." He paused, reaching down to pat Buddy's head. "It took this guy right here to show me what true wealth looks like. It's not about what you have, but about what you give. It's about the connections we make, the lives we touch, the community we build together." As Michael spoke, he saw nods of agreement, tears in some eyes and smiles of recognition. He told the story of Buddy's rescue, of the chain of events that had led to this moment. He spoke of the challenges they had faced and overcome together, of the lessons learned along the way. "This center," he continued, gesturing to the building around them, "is more than just bricks and mortar. It's a promise that we can create a better future if we work together, if we believe in each other, if we never give up on the power of kindness and compassion." As he concluded his speech, the applause was deafening. But for Michael, the most meaningful response came from beside him, Buddy's enthusiastic bark, as if the dog was adding his own seal of approval. The ribbon-cutting ceremony that followed was a blur of handshakes, hugs, and congratulations. But through it all, Michael felt a sense of calm certainty. This was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. As the crowds began to disperse, Sarah found her way to his side. She had been instrumental in every aspect of the project, from the state-of-the-art animal shelter to the community outreach programs. More than that, she had been Michael's partner in every sense of the word, supporting him through the ups and downs, challenging him to be his best self. "So," she said, a playful smile on her lips, "what's next? Surely the great Michael Thompson isn't going to rest on his laurels now." Michael laughed, pulling her close. "Well, I was thinking, maybe it's time to take this show on the road. There are other cities out there that could use a little Thompson Foundation magic. What do you say? Ready for a new adventure?" Sarah's eyes lit up with excitement. "Always," she replied, sealing her answer with a kiss. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the transformed neighborhood, Michael, Sarah, and Buddy took a quiet walk through the streets. Children played in new parks where once there had been only abandoned lots. Small businesses bustled with activity. Everywhere they looked, there were signs of renewal and hope. They ended up on the beach where it had all begun. The private stretch of sand was now part of a public coastline, open for all to enjoy. As they stood there, watching the waves roll in, Michael felt a profound sense of gratitude. "You know," he said softly to Sarah, "I used to think that success meant having more than everyone else. Now I know it's about giving more, loving more, being more." Sarah squeezed his hand. "And it all started with one act of kindness," she added, looking down at Buddy, who was happily chasing seagulls along the water's edge. As they turned to head back, Michael took one last look at the ocean. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was the end of one chapter, but he knew it was also the beginning of something even greater. With Buddy trotting ahead and Sarah by his side, Michael Thompson walked into the future, ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. He had found his true purpose, his true family, and his true home, not in the mansion on the hill, but in the hearts of the community he had helped to rebuild. And as night fell over Newport, the lights of the Thompson Community Center shone like a beacon, a reminder that even the smallest act of compassion can spark a revolution of the heart.